Awesome.
Let's start at Northwestern. That's an incredible journalism school. How did you get there? Did you know that you wanted to be a journalist?
I did, yeah. In high school, I did some part-time work for the local newspaper, doing like their sports agate and stuff like that. So just collecting scores and names and everything like that, and got to write a few more like small featurey type stories. I always knew I liked writing. Realized that I kind of like fiction writing wasn't for me. So yeah, I fell into journalism. So I did go to Northwestern intending to go to the journalism school.
And then did you jump right into sport reporting, beat reporting immediately? Or was it kind of like a gradual, like, hey, this may be something I want to get into?
Yeah, I'd say like I've always been pretty open about what topic I want to cover within journalism. I've never felt like married to sports per se, which is, I guess, kind of weird for a person working at Sports Illustrated and working on a book about mental health in sports to say. But I started my career at PolitiFact, so fact checking politicians, and I've never felt married to one area. But yeah, right now, I mean, sports happens to be the bulk of what I'm interested in. And so, yeah, really happy to be pursuing that.
And then you joined Sports Illustrated in January of 2020. How did COVID impact? I mean, we weren't even sure if when live sports were going to come back at that time. How did that impact the way that you reported on these issues?
Yeah, well, it definitely ruled out any in-person stuff, which is a shame. But better safe than sorry. So I'm not complaining about it. But yeah, it was really weird, even just from like an internal work perspective. Like we weren't sure how to make a magazine remotely. So on a very basic level, it was, everything sort of changed. There are many coworkers I haven't seen in 2.5 years. And yeah, from a sports perspective, there were no live sports, but um, it gave me the opportunity to think more creatively about how to cover sports. For example, in late April, I ended up publishing, in late April of 2020, I should say, I ended up publishing an article about the mental health impact on athletes of the pandemic. So we had published something about like the physical impact on athletes' bodies. And I was like, well, I wonder how their mental health is being affected. And that kind of led me to Simone Biles, who graciously agreed to do a quick interview, and some other athletes who were great. And so that's how, well, I was pretty much obsessed with mental health in sports before that, but that was the start of my time at SI being really interested in that. And yeah, the pandemic just was sort of a vehicle to think more creatively about coverage.
I mean, I talk a lot to athletes about how COVID impacted them. I mean, they were out of practice. There were a couple that I talked to that when kind of working through that timeline in their life, they're like, I didn't even see the majority of my team. We had to work out in like groups of 5, go to the gym and work in groups of like 3.
Yeah.
Work out over Zoom, like it was so interesting hearing that perspective and then hearing you say, we had to really kind of work outside of the box, like around the issue, because there was nothing to live cover.
Right, exactly. It was a little bit of like, are we gonna have enough stuff? Like, what is our purpose in this moment? But I think it ended up being really important to chronicle what was going on without sports, because it's not like we had any fewer athletes. There was still plenty to do, just not in the traditional way.
And then when you think of athletes like Simone Biles, I mean, Kevin Love comes up a lot with kind of the trailblazing push of athletes talking candidly about their mental health. How did Sports Illustrated take that dialogue and kind of weave it through the content that they were producing at that time?
Yeah, I think it's coming up more and more, obviously. So I think it's always something to consider. I mean, when I approach an article for SI, even if it's not about mental health per se, I still keep the mental health aspect in mind. Like I write a lot about transgender athletes, and there are obviously mental health concerns there when they're being attacked by state legislatures and everything like that. So I think more and more my colleagues and I at SI are realizing that mental health can be a part of every story. It doesn't have to be a story, quote unquote, about mental health.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting point, because I do feel like with the athletes that I'm talking to, the forefront is how they've dealt with mental health issues. And it's really cool when that becomes a little part of their story. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're this incredible person outside of whatever they've dealt with on the field, on the court, on the turf, whatever it may be. And I just
Mm-hmm.
think that finding the person inside of the athlete is really cool, and mental health advocacy helps with that.
Yeah. And I like what you said about how it's like a little part of them, because I think sometimes the way we get trapped into talking about someone like Simone Biles is like, oh, she's a mental health advocate. I'm like, well, yes, but she's also so much more. Like, this is just part of her story. It's not the story. So, yeah, it's about balancing these different things that all come together to make an elite athlete. And, like you said, a person.
I just read through your story on Sarah Fuller, and I had no idea about the after Vandy experience. How did you approach telling that story because of everything that she had gone through media wise while she was in her undergrad?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. She's definitely someone you talk to, and you can tell she has a lot of media training, which I think in a lot of cases can be a negative for reporters. But in this case, I think it was a positive because she was very comfortable with me, and she had done this before. She knew she wasn't going to share anything that she wasn't comfortable sharing. But she also knew what she was comfortable sharing, and that was, as you can see, a lot. And I sort of fell into that story because I was writing an essay for the magazine about mental toughness and how we kind of see that trope play out with like TV commentators and pundits and everything like that. And I had seen her tweet about like, it was something about how, mental toughness is something we need to kind of like do away with, for lack of a better explanation here. And so I wanted to interview her for that piece. And then she kind of started going into that whole story about how she needed to step away from soccer, how the last couple years had been. And so, yeah, I just kind of approached that story with an open mind because I hadn't heard much about Sarah Fuller since her bandy kicking days either. And I don't think a lot of people had. So I just approached it with a lot of curiosity and empathy.
And then I also read the mental toughness article. I this is I like to say that there are about a handful of topics that I feel like I talk about every single week on this podcast. One of them is athlete identity. The other one is mental toughness. And the question that I end up asking the majority of people that I talk to is, how would you redefine mental toughness? So
That's really
I'm going to
interesting.
ask it to you as well. How would you redefine
Yeah,
mental toughness?
I will say that it doesn't necessarily need a redefinition. I would say that the way it's meant to be defined, at least based on the mental toughness expert that I talk to, who does research on this all the time, I mean, he was saying it's a really important skill. It's about um, kind of getting, athletes on this elite level inherently kind of have this skill, and it's about building it up and cultivating it, and to reach those big goals. Like, how do you get from point A to point B? And so I think as a tenet of positive psychology, it's actually working as it should be. It's just that everyone else doesn't understand the meaning of it, and they twist it back on athletes to say like, oh, you're not mentally tough enough. And that's never what the word was intended to do.
Yeah, I brought on a sports psychologist, one of the very first episodes of this podcast, and I asked him, how would you define mental toughness? And what he told me was that mental toughness in itself is not a phrase. It's not really a term. It's an umbrella usage. And so then my follow-up question was, okay, well, how would you break up the tenets of mental toughness? I mean, what are the pillars that make someone mentally tough? How would you answer that question?
Oh, that's a great question. I think like grit, which is a more like day-to-day quality, is definitely a part of mental toughness. I think empathy and emotional intelligence is a part of mental toughness. what else? I mean, like, just the ability to kind of process your own emotions and um, physical pain as well, and just kind of relay that into your performance, just like channel that, I guess I'm saying, into your performance. I think those are some of the most important components. And I think often like emotional intelligence and stuff gets left out of that conversation.
I would completely agree. I think that, especially, I mean, when you think about someone intentionally trying to be mentally tough, you do think of football a lot, and the coach to player camaraderie hierarchy that exists. And I just think that there's a lot of work to be done with football coaches and kind of breaking apart what someone being mentally tough really means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is something we see a lot with football in particular. And we also have this expectation of football players as a society that, like, as the mental toughness expert I talked to pointed out, like, we don't have that same expectation of like a diver. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, because we shouldn't have this expectation of anyone really. But at the same time, like, do we respect divers less? Like, what does that mean? Like, so I think, yeah, what you said about coaching is interesting, because I think that applies to basically every sport too, where we're kind of learning that coaches are maybe behind the curve a little bit when it comes to helping athletes with their mental health and supporting them, rather than like perpetuating a stigma. That's not to say all coaches are behind the curve, but I think a lot of them still are.
The episode that just came out this week was with a Team USA Paralympic coxswain for Team USA rowing. And she was diagnosed with OCD, severe OCD, and she didn't tell her coaches. And because she was worried that she would get kicked off the team and there would be so many repercussions. And she didn't tell her coach until more than a decade later, after her rowing career had come and gone. And her coach was just like, okay. And she was like, you couldn't have told me that a decade ago. Like, I was so worried about what you were going to say, how you were going to react, that I withheld it from you. And now you're standing here looking at me like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Like, just, it's fine. And I feel like a lot of athletes feel like that about their coaches. If I tell my coach this, they'll look at me differently. They'll hold back my start, or they'll cap my playing time.
Mm-hmm.
And coaches aren't really doing much to dissuade that thought process.
Yeah, totally. It's hard because a coach might think that they're kind of neutral about these issues, but it's not really an issue you can be neutral on. You're either helping or you're hurting. And I think you have to be like really, really open with your players and really, really clear that mental health will not affect playing time or starting or anything like that. And, that it's something to be worked on together as a team and, supported that way.
How many athletes, when you sit down with them, end up divulging mental health struggles that you maybe didn't even tend to talk about during the interview?
Yeah, well, Sarah Fuller was a good example of that, because I wasn't really asking about her personal experiences. I was just asking about the trope of mental toughness in general. But yeah, I'd say these days when I sit down with athletes, most of the time I am directly asking about their own struggles with mental health. So it's kind of hard to say, but yeah, I think everybody has some sort of story to tell in that vein. So I would encourage reporters, even if that's not what you set out to cover, to be open to the possibility that the athlete might bring that up.
And it is funny that you say that, because as I'm putting together my questions for each of the athletes, I'm only pulling from what they've already disclosed to social media, to their roster, to their other local news outlets that may do a feature on them. I'm only pulling from there. And when I talk to an athlete and they're like, oh, and yeah, I was hospitalized for an eating disorder. And I'm like, hold up. Like, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Have you had any experiences like that where they just surprise you with a little tidbit of information that you're like, okay, now we have to follow this?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, like, sometimes we'll see like a hint of something in the press, like you said, or just goes to social media or something like that. But oftentimes that isn't the full story, because they're understandably still afraid to tell the full story. But when they sit down with a person and, they sense they can trust you, they do go off and, go in these unexpected directions.
Do you think that media training has an impact on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I was kind of saying before, I think it can be good and bad. Like I think you can make it a good thing in that, you're sitting down with someone who's already comfortable talking to reporters. It doesn't have to mean that they're comfortable hiding things or they're setting out to like trick you. Like it doesn't have to be seen that way. It can be seen as a good thing where they're prepared. They know what they're getting into. You're not going to surprise them. You're less likely to traumatize them if they have this experience with the media before. So yeah, I think it can work to a reporter's advantage.
What do you think is the biggest issue facing athletes who want to talk about their mental health but aren't?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it
And
probably
I will say like aren't / can't.
Right. I think that's an important distinction. I think I would say a lot of it does come back to that like threat of playing time. A lot of it comes back to just privacy concerns and not wanting their team to necessarily know everything about them, even when their team is entitled to a great deal of medical information about them. I think that can be kind of scary. There's this idea that like, oh, these teams have mental health resources on staff, and I think that's a really good thing. But a lot of people still want to go outside those resources to, their own private professionals. And yeah, I think that aspect of it might hold some people back from wanting to talk about it or being able to talk about it freely.
Is there a breakdown between help seekers and resources?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there are a lot more help seekers than there are resources. A good example is if you look at the college level, where more and more athletic departments do have someone available to talk about mental health concerns. They do have a licensed professional. At the same time, you look at that and it's like one licensed professional for like how many hundreds of athletes? And it's like, well, that's still a big problem. You can say you have someone and it's good PR to have someone, and it's certainly better than having no one. But yeah, I think there's this huge imbalance between people who need help and the people available to help them.
I mean, even if you look at the professional level, there are sports psychologists in all the major league clubhouses.
Mm-hmm.
But the minor leagues get a roving sports psych individual who travels all the way up and down all the affiliates.
That's right.
And you may see that person once every 2 months.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's not helpful.
No, I mean, it's really hard to make progress that way, and it's really hard to develop trust that way.
And that's even professional baseball. I mean, granted, you're in the minors, but you're still a professional baseball player who is not getting adequate resources.
Right. And then on top of that, they're not being paid a living wage. So it's not likely they can go outside for help. And, they feel like every move they make could jeopardize their chance at getting called up to the majors.
I mean, you and I could talk about that in itself for an hour.
Yes.
But getting back to college athletics, how do you see that issue being remedied? Do we need more sports psych professionals per athletic department? Do we need a different type? Psychologists versus psychiatrists? How does this get fixed?
Yeah, I think just more people in general is a good thing. Having a psychologist and a psychiatrist is a good thing. Having mental skills coaches is a good thing too. I mean, a lot of people will kind of say that's not as important, but even having someone available there to support an athlete, even if they have to then refer you out to a licensed psychologist, I think is still a good thing. And for some people, it's a more approachable way into mental health, is to talk about, building this mental strength and building these mental skills in a positive psychology kind of way, rather than getting right into like, hey, what's your trauma?
When you talk to athletes, what is their first experience with mental health professionals? Is it in high school, college, professional level? When is
It
that
varies a
topic
lot.
first addressed?
Yeah, it varies a whole lot. Some of them have people in high school that they've seen either privately or someone that was brought in to talk to, say, their basketball team. Some people, that introduction comes in college, but sometimes only like vaguely and quickly. Like sometimes you'll talk to an athlete who was told like, oh, let's visualize like you putting the basketball in the hoop. It's like, okay, that's fine, but it's not even a thorough visualization exercise, and it's certainly not any help with your mental health issues. So I think, some people on the other hand have great sports psychologists in college. It sounds like Sarah Fuller was one of those people, at least at North Texas. But yeah, it just varies so much. And I think that's a problem, is like you don't necessarily know what to expect. And if you're in high school trying to commit to a college, you don't necessarily know all the questions you should be asking.
So looking back, if you are committing to a school, what should you be looking for in terms of not only mental health resources, but also just success help?
Yeah, I mean it's hard, right? Because if you're a Division 1 athlete, there's a lot more resources you can expect, not just with mental health, but with tutoring, with basically every aspect, with nutritionists, a mental, a D1 school is going to have a lot more for you all around. But not everyone can play at a D1 level, and that's okay. But yeah, if you're looking at D3, probably any resource is a good starting point. Like it's hard. I mean, I think you should be looking like holistically at all the resources you have. The more the better. I know like Dartmouth is a good example of like they have this kind of like peak performance program, they call it, that's like they focus on academics and athletics and mental health and all these things in tandem, in the goal of like making a more holistic, like complete athlete and person. Um, and I think that's a really positive thing, and I would look for something like that if I were an athlete committing to a school.
It's so interesting that you point out Dartmouth, because at the beginning of this podcast, I had nearly back-to-back athletes from Dartmouth.
Oh,
And the way that they conceptualized the mental health conversation has been so different than the majority of everyone I've talked to since. They were so candid, they were so open, they talked so freely while knowing the terminology of what they were talking about. It felt like they asked the right questions, but both of them. Like they had a
yeah,
really well-oiled, well-viewed thought process toward what they had gone through.
that's great. I mean, yeah, I've talked to a bunch of Dartmouth athletes myself, and yeah, they're all very thoughtful and very aware of the resources they have and how not everyone is maybe as lucky as they are.
What other athletes have struck a chord like that while you were talking to them?
Oh my God, so many. So many. I've talked to Shamiko Holtzclaw, the former WNBA player, a number of times now, and or really just twice. I don't know why I said that, but I've talked to her twice for extended periods of time, and she is so thoughtful about her mental health, and what she was going through at all these different points in her life, whether it be college or during her career or after her career. Um, so I think she's a really good example. But really, like, I've noticed that like everyone I talk to, regardless of like what their vocabulary might be or what their experience with professionals might be, they're all the experts in telling their own story. So I think that's kind of the important thing to come back to, is that they all have this experience with themselves that like you or I can't understand or speak for them or replicate. So even if someone isn't as well versed in these issues, doesn't have the background that say a Dartmouth student might have, they still have something to contribute to the conversation.
Do you find that a specific sport does that better?
Interesting. I've never thought about that before. I would say like, hmm, I would say that like basketball is one because uh it's kind of like the sport, and we've talked about this as a society on like social justice kind of level, where like basketball players are kind of like more free to be themselves on the court than say maybe a football player is, even just on a very basic like visual level. Like a football player wears a helmet. Basketball, you can see their face, it's all about their personalities, they're in their style of play. They don't get like fined as much for like celebrating as like an NFL athlete might, for example. um, and I find that this all holds true on the mental health level too. I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen Kevin Love, DeMar DeRozan, someone like Shamiko Holdsclaw come out and say these things, because I think they have a level of comfort with themselves that they know is backed up, at least in part, not perfectly, but backed up at least in part by their leagues.
And how would you react to an athlete talking about what they've gone through, and then people on Twitter, people on Instagram, people on social media coming back and saying, we're just watching you for entertainment. We don't care about what you're going through off the court.
Yeah, I mean, that's a shame that some people think that way, that some people think of athletes as like less than human. And I know I'm saying some people, but it really is a lot of people. And that's kind of scary for our society. That's not great news that people think that way. Um, but I think some of those people react that way as a knee-jerk reaction, and they're not really thinking through the implications of what they're saying. And I'm saying this because even some athletes I've talked to, if you take Simone Biles as an example, even some athletes I've talked to, including Sarah Fuller, including this former Major League Baseball player, Bill Pulsifer, who played for the Mets and a number of other teams as a pitcher, they both recently told me that they originally didn't respect Simone Biles' decision at the Olympics to step away. And then they both kind of interrogated themselves later and were like, oh, wait, that was me being a little unfair. And I understand it now. Like, I understand that she was doing what's best for her team. She was doing what's best for herself, her mind, and her body. So I think even like people closer to being in their shoes than like a random person on the internet, I think even they still have trouble like conceptualizing that someone else might be struggling, and they might have trouble interrogating their own knee-jerk reactions.
And that is really interesting.
Yeah, it's something that surprised me when I talked to Sarah, and she was very candid about how her thought process around that changed. And then I talked to Bill a couple weeks later, and I was like, oh, no way, someone just told me that.
Yeah, I mean, even athletes that are in the same position can't always relate.
Right. Every sport is so different. Everyone's experience is so different. Their ages are all so different. And I think there are just so many factors where you have this understanding of like, oh, I'm doing the right thing, but I'm not going to give that other person the benefit of the doubt. And it's not out of malice. It's just out of like I said, this knee-jerk feeling that like other people should be mentally tough.
I mean, I'm a strong believer that all people are good. People are just misunderstood. And that kind of plays into what you're saying. It's not that they're wrong. It's not that they're doing it narcissistically.
Mm-hmm.
They have taken a step back and they're like, I can't perform at my best when I feel like this. And not everyone has to understand that.
Right. I think there are some people in this conversation in bad faith, and it's mostly like right-wing pundits and writers and stuff like that who are just out to attack, like, say, Simone, like a young Black woman, because they feel they can and they feel like she's easy prey, even though we all know she's not. But yeah, I think most people, to your point, are good faith actors.
So when you're looking at all of these stories and you're conceptualizing them coming out and coming together, what makes you say, I have a lot here, let's write a book?
Yeah. For me, the genesis of it really was that article about the pandemic and how elite athletes were navigating it mental health wise. Just the response to that article was really strong, I thought. And I don't know, I think when you're turning over a certain topic in your mind for years, like as a writer, it might be time to be like, okay, what if this is a book? I mean, to be clear, I don't think the answer is always yes. Like, what if it's just a tweet or a blog post or, I don't know, a pamphlet of some sort. Like, not everything has to be a book. That's not what I'm trying to say. But yeah, I just, there are so many facets to this, and so many people have so many different stories. Obviously, we know no two are alike, even in the same sport. Like I've talked to Michaela Maroney, for example, another gymnast, and in her way, in a lot of ways, her experiences overlap with Simone in some really important ways. But in a lot of ways, what they were feeling inside was different too. And so I think once you realize that everyone has something new and unique to share, you're like, okay, maybe collectively all these stories are a book.
I mean, shared trauma is fascinating to me. I mean, especially with the USA Gymnastics falling out and all of the legal ramifications of that, and all of the mental and physical ramifications as well. I mean, that's a huge mountain to climb as a 13, 14, 15-year-old. So
yeah.
how do you get a few years older and look back at that and say, now I'm ready to talk?
I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine being in their shoes, but I'm not even going to try to speculate as to what was going through their head. But I know when I talked to Michaela, she was very ready to talk. She had been open about it for longer than Simone had, for example. And I think for her, it just became part of her story and part of her mental health journey. With Simone, it was a little different. I remember that her people didn't want me asking about Larry Nassar, and you have to respect that. Even though she's been public about it, doesn't mean she's ready to be public about it every second of every day. So I think it's one of those things that every athlete is processing in a different way, yet they also have this bond of shared trauma.
And what are you hoping to get across with the publishing of this book?
I think first and foremost, I just want to get across that hey, these athletes are here, they're struggling. We need some solutions as a society. Do I know exactly in every situation what those are? Not really, but I think we need to start thinking about this as a problem that can have solutions, and not just something that is bound to happen for eternity to every single athlete. And I also really want people who read the book to interrogate their own biases and their own conceptions of what it means to be an athlete struggling, and what it means for you as a fan to root for these athletes who are struggling, and what it means to just be in that situation, and what you can really do to support an athlete, even if you don't know them, you're not talking to them like I am. How can you incorporate those lessons and those feelings into your everyday life?
So how do we as fans take that first step?
I think just listening, right? Just being open to hearing those stories when people come forward with them, and thinking about maybe there's people in your own life who have had similar experiences. Just thinking about what you would tell a friend in that situation, or thinking about if there are causes you can donate to, if there are people you can support, if there people, things you can say to speak out about this.
One of the things that I do after every podcast interview is just kind of generally ask, are there any foundations that you'd like to support? I can put all the links in the show notes if there's anything that you want to kind of drive listeners to. And there are a ton of people who say the national, give me numbers to the domestic hotline, the domestic violence hotline. Or I interviewed an indigenous distance runner. He is Navajo, and he used distance running, which is native to his culture. They do it every morning. They go on prayer runs. It's just kind of inherent to what he does. And reservation schooling is just not really up to par. It's like 4% of high schoolers actually go to college. And he defied those odds. He used distance running to get to Colorado Boulder. And he went there on a cross-country scholarship. He got his degree, almost made Team USA, and then is now going to medical school to come back and be a reservation doctor.
Wow.
And I swear it's one of the best interviews that I've ever done, because it was so candid, but it's those situations where you just kind of like coax them just a little bit and then it all comes out, and it turned into like, I mean, that was probably episode 11 and we're almost to 80 now.
Wow.
And I just remember that one, like there are a list of like maybe 5 that stick out in my head, and that's one of them, just because that was so incredible. And it wasn't a story that he was really necessarily well versed at telling. I was one of the only outlets that he'd ever told. And it was just, I saw him open up and get better at telling his story through that. And that was a really incredible way to kind of use this platform. And then when I asked him the question, okay, well, like, what do you have any resources? He just gave me a whole list of resources. And like, it's that kind of platform that I love giving athletes, because you just never know what's going to happen.
Right.
What is it about the work that you do for Sports Illustrated that you feel so fulfilled by doing? We only have a minute and a half on this one. If you don't feel like you can answer that in a minute and a half, you can exit and come back in.
Yeah, let's just exit just in case.
Okay.
All right, see ya.
Bye.
A long time no see.
All right, we are back to recording. What is it about your work with SI that is so fulfilling?
Yeah, I think it's just like the fact that people trust me to tell their stories. We all know they could go to the Players Tribune. They could go to any other excellent journalist as well. They could go to their own Instagram page. And a lot of times they do more than one of those things, which I think is good. But it's feeling like, yeah, like I do have this trust, and like I have something to say on these issues. That's actually something my agent has been pushing me toward for the book. She's like, you're an expert. You're not just relaying facts. Like, you have things to say too. And I'm like trying to embrace that and trying to put some of my opinion into the book.
Which presents a really interesting question. How much of their story do you let them tell versus you filling in the gaps?
I like to let them tell as much as possible, but then kind of like rely on myself to contextualize it, to put it in conversation with other people's experiences and other resources. So yeah, I think you have to rely on them as much as possible, not necessarily in direct quotes, but just relaying their feelings and their experiences through both direct and indirect quotes. And then, yeah, like I said, just contextualizing it, putting it in the bigger picture, telling people not what to think about it, but what they might want to think about it.
When we do see an athlete coming out on social media about what they've been through, whether it's a four picture like notes app post on Twitter, or whether it's the same going out on Instagram, how can we as fans embrace that platform that we have given them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just about saying publicly that you support them. I think it's like starting a conversation with your friend, being like, hey, did you see so and so did this? Like, what do you think about that? I think it's that simple, right? Like, it's continuing to watch their events. It's like buying their jersey, you know, or better than buying their jersey is buying, like, I don't know, something like a breaking tee where like they get some of the money from, you know, the players union and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's just continuing to support them the same way you have, and trying to take their stories into your everyday life.
And then from the athlete perspective, how do you see them reacting when you ask them to tell their mental health story?
Yeah. I think it's interesting because some of them are hesitant, some of them are like very, very upfront, and anywhere in between. And some of them may even have regrets about what they tell you. And I think that's hard. And I think you have to grapple with like, is there anything in that conversation I could have done better? Or was that person just not ready? Or and you know, and then they see what you wrote online, and it's not like you're writing something to please them, because that's not how journalism works. But on a certain level, you want them to feel like you represented them well. You know, and if it's a story about that includes their faults, like then that counts too. But you want to feel like you represented them fairly and accurately.
Have you ever had an athlete come back to you and say, this, I didn't really like this?
Not a main subject of a story, but you know, when I read about Lolo Jones, the hurdler and the bobsledder, and the reality star, I should say, there was a runner that I interviewed, who I won't name, just to, you know, you can read it in the article, but just not to cause her any more grief. She was talking to me about Lolo and kind of like, you know, why didn't other runners get this attention that Lolo got? And did it have to do with her skin color being lighter than some of the other Black women she was competing with and against? And kind of really questioning my choice to even profile Lolo. I obviously found Lolo very interesting for a number of reasons. She's had like 20,000 careers. She has been very open about her mental health, especially with me, about her PTSD and her suicidal thoughts and all that. But yeah, I got an email from the secondary source saying that she wasn't happy with how I portrayed it. She said I misconstrued her words, and you know, that's a really hard thing to deal with.
When athletes approach you, I mean, how much of covering a story, telling a story, is them approaching you versus you saying this could be something?
I think it's a lot of me saying this could be something. A lot of times athletes, even if they're ready to tell their stories, they don't know exactly who they want to tell them to. So it's not like I get emails like, hey, can you write a story about this? Although I did, sometimes with transgender athletes, which is like kind of like my other beat, I do get more emails there of people like, hey, I'm ready to speak up, like, especially in light of all these attacks on them. So like, for example, I had a preliminary conversation with a trans athlete the other day who did come to me through the Athlete Ally organization. And, you know, she is feeling ready to speak up. But I find that on the mental illness beat, that happens a lot less. So yeah, it's not like my inbox is overflowing with requests. It's more of like, how can I seek out people who might have something meaningful to say?
How do you source those people?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are really obvious because they're famous and we know their stories. Some of them are less obvious. And I think in those cases, I just follow my gut. And, you know, sometimes I fall into it. Like with Sarah Fuller, I totally fell into it just based on one tweet she sent. And honestly, like she hadn't been in the public spotlight for like a year and a half. So that one I feel kind of lucky about. And there's situations like those where I maybe see something posted on social media and source it that way, or I maybe see like a hint of a line in another journalist story and say, huh, I bet there's more there.
That's basically exactly how I do it as well. And
Nice.
I think it helps that everyone is very candid on social.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it has become kind of a diary of sorts, for better or
Yes.
for worse. And you also kind of almost vet the people that you end up talking to, because you're like, okay, well, they're ready to tell their story and they know how to do it.
Right.
Like, I'm not going to be pulling teeth trying to get the answers that I'm looking for.
Right. Because that's not fun for anyone on this topic. There's some topics where you have to do that and where it's important to do that. But I think by and large, when you're writing about mental health, the person has to have some degree of readiness.
Yeah. what is a story that you can remember that sticks out to you in the same way that my distance runners does?
Honestly, my story with Lolo Jones sticks out to me because she has been through hell and back, and she is just so candid about all of it. She is transparent about the times where she wasn't making any money and how she feels about how Olympians are treated in that regard. And I just, I had known her, I had respected her beforehand, but I just talking with her for so long, and she gave me so much of her time. We probably had like 2 hour long conversations and then like another 30-minute one after that. And she just had so much to say and so much to reveal beyond who people thought she was.
And then how are you putting this book together? Is it, I mean, what's the thought process? How are you storyboarding this essentially?
Well, first of all, am I putting this book together? Sometimes I'm not so sure. Like,
I saw your tweet and you were like, Julie, write the book, sit down and write the book.
The truth is, I filed more than half of it, or not filed to like my publishing house editor, but filed to like a freelance editor I'm using as like an extra layer of security. So I'm not doing too bad in all seriousness, but yeah, so I think it's really important to cover both mental performance and mental illness. One of the reasons why is because I was told a book all about mental illness when it sells, and I sort of understand that even if I don't like the answer. So the first third of the book is really about the history of like sports psychology and mental performance and all that and how it's used today. The second third is really about this movement to speak out about mental health from athletes, whether on college campuses, whether during the pandemic, whether way before the pandemic. And then the last third is kind of like a grab bag of like, here's some things athletes struggle with. And then the last chapters before the conclusion, at least, is about stepping away from sport, whether it's due to retirement, whether it's due to the pandemic, whether it's due to injury. So I'd like to think that it kind of brings it all together, because the end of the career is something that all athletes face at one point or another.
Yeah. And that, I mean, I love when the interviews turn into that. I mean, what am I outside of being an athlete? Now that my career is done, whether it's because I aged out, because I got an injury, because XYZ, who am I now?
Yeah. I found that like some people have really interesting stuff to say on that, or athletes who have like retired and then unretired. Because
Tom Brady.
Yes, man, my team had to make a whole magazine about his retirement, and then he unretired like not very long afterward.
It was like a couple days. He's like, psych.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Tom. I guess you're keeping us in business, but not making me happy about it. But yeah, either athletes who have retired and then come back, or athletes who have taken a year off due to like injury or like taken some sort of gap year, I guess. They often have had to figure out what their life is like beyond their sport and what their identity is. And yeah, that's not an easy question. I know I talked to a sports psychologist, and I think this quote is going to be in the book, about how basically, like he said, you're in a good position if you know who you are before your coach comes up to you and says, okay, hand in your playbook, like it's over for you. Like if you can figure that stuff out before your career ends, you're just like ahead of the game.
I think that that's a great quote, and I think that that should be included.
Thank you.
Did you find that conceptualizing this book was difficult, or was it something that came very naturally based on prior experience, prior articles that all kind of culminated into this method of sharing?
In terms of conceptualizing it, do you mean like the structure?
Yeah. So was there a certain way that you were going in saying, okay, this is how I kind of want to lay it out?
Yeah. As a writer, I'm like notoriously bad at structuring stories. So even if it's like 1,000-word piece, I'll like be cutting and pasting all the paragraphs. Like, is this the right order? Yeah, you do that too.
Yeah.
It's hard. But yeah, so I think I really struggled with how to conceptualize it structure wise and how to best lay out a story of this magnitude, stories of this magnitude, I should say. And my first few attempts were very bad. And I, I don't know. I don't even know if I'm in love with the way I just like outlined it to you, because it feels sort of random at times, especially the final third is like, why am I focusing on this condition and not this other one? Um, I don't think there's a perfect way to do it. I think you just have to commit more than anything.
I mean, in the same way that we talk about mental health by just saying, do it,
Yeah,
go ahead. I think that
exactly.
writing works the same way. You
I hope so.
just have to put the intro paragraph down and then just go.
Exactly. Yeah. Something I've also been grappling with is like, maybe this book won't be like the best thing I've ever written. And I think that has to be okay. Like, I think getting it out there is the most important thing. And, just I have to be okay and hope for a good response in terms of just accepting myself, and like that it might not be super easy if you have a 75,000 word product to make every word a word you're super proud of.
That I feel like that's so transferable to sports as well. I mean, not every pass is going to be spot on.
Yeah,
Not every goal can be saved, you
exactly.
know? And to think that it can depletes your mission.
Yeah, that actually reminds me. I was talking to Brianna Scurry, the legendary USWNT goalkeeper from the 99ers. And because she has a memoir out that deals a lot with her mental illness. And one of the things I was talking to her about was this mentality that she had in the 99 World Cup final when it went to penalty kicks. And she was just the whole time thinking like, I have to save one goal. I have to save one goal. My team can score 5 and then we win it 5-4 in the shootout. And she even picked the woman who she knew she could save against. Like, she just sensed something in her body language that wasn't confident enough, and she's like, this is the one. I can save this one. And I think that's a really interesting mentality that like more of us should get on board with.
That's incredible.
Yeah, she's an incredible person all around.
I mean, what do you go in looking for out of stories specific to mental health? I mean, is there a desired result?
Yes and no. Like, I just want to hear something I haven't heard before and that my readers maybe haven't heard before, or present something in a new way, or, you know, I struggled a little bit with the Sarah Fuller story because I'm like, of course, this is newsworthy that this, like, historically important player, has feelings like this and had to step away after being in the spotlight for like a hot second, right? Um, but I also kind of struggled with like, is this story saying something new? Like, how much value is there in just like repeating a story of depression and suicidal thoughts? Not that hers wasn't unique, because everyone's is unique, but was my story advancing the conversation? And I still don't know if I know the answer to that. Like, I try to write something that like advances the conversation, that thinks of something new, um, instead of just being like, this person was struggling. Isn't that sad?
When is a story complete?
It's not. It just has a deadline. I mean, I think it's complete when you get a good sense of the person you're writing about or the issue you're writing about. Like, I think a good guideline, something that I probably learned in journalism school, is like, a story is complete if you keep calling up sources and hearing the same thing. Like, you found the right people, and you found like the right window to tell a story. Um, I don't think that applies to every situation, but I think um, I think it's a good benchmark. Yeah.
How can we as journalists get better at telling stories of athlete mental health?
Don't presume you know everything going into it. Like I said, trying to advance the conversation rather than just saying, "Hey, here's a thing that happened." Just interrogating our own biases and which is easier said than done. Like, I think you have to go into it asking yourself, like, what am I expecting to hear? Why might that be wrong? What do I think the solutions are? What are the barriers in the way to that? Like, I think there's just a lot of questions you have to ask yourself.
Where do you see mental health, the dialogue surrounding mental health going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, that's something I like asking my sources, and everyone has kind of like a slightly different answer. Mostly, I just want us to stop saying like starting a conversation or starting a dialogue, because it's been started by people like decades ago, at the very least. And so I mean, you asked me where I see it going, not where I want it to go. But I hope that's where
Well, you can answer
it's
both
going.
then.
Yeah. I think hopefully it'll become, like we're talking about near the beginning of this call, like hopefully it'll become a situation where mental health is just a part of someone's story and not like their personal brand. Like, hopefully it's just like one aspect of who they are, and we're all comfortable with that. Is that going to happen in 5 to 10 years? I don't know. I'm not super optimistic, but I'm also just a pessimist in general. So who knows?
Is there anything else that you wanted to say, include, talk about before we conclude today?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say, like, I'm bipolar, and that influences and informs my work a lot. It's not like that automatically makes me easy to trust because I have experience with mental illness, but it's something I do mention to sources a lot of times. It's something I'm going to be open about in the book. And so I think that is something that just informs my work that's worth mentioning.
That's really interesting. Do you think that that makes you a more empathetic storyteller?
I go back and forth. I think anyone should feel empowered to know that they have the empathy to tell stories like this. I don't think it should be limited to people with lived experiences. But at the same time, like, do I come into an interview knowing which questions to ask, knowing which to hold off on a little bit? Like, yes, naturally, I think I have a good sense of that. And that's partly because of my own background.
Is there, let me see when this interview is coming out. And then is there any questions you have for me?
What got you interested in mental health?
Yeah, so let me just figure out when this is coming out, and then I will get you that answer.
Mhm.
Because it's a long one. It's a weighted question. So your interview, this episode is coming out on August 10th.
Okay.
So you have a solid couple weeks.
Mhm.
Once that does come out, I will put the whole thing on all of the platforms. We're out on Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud, Amazon Music, and Audible.
Nice.
And then social media, this entire interview will go up on YouTube. And then if there's anything that you wanted me to edit out, please tell me, because the entire thing is going straight to YouTube.
Gotcha.
And then Instagram and Twitter will have graphics of you. So if you could send me a picture that you would like to be used for social, that would be great. And then a little clip, like a minute clip of part of our interview, will also be posted to Instagram and Twitter.
Cool.
So what got me into this?
Yeah.
Okay, so I played soccer. I'm going to stop recording.
Yeah.